Hello and welcome to the next part of this series. In this part we're going to be building the heads-up display for the game. This is where most of the player's input will be controlled. We're going to keep it quite basic and general for now and probably add to it in further parts. So to start with, we'll include some HUD elements that are common to city builders, such as a panel for selecting objects to build, a panel for examining objects in the world, and a panel for showing the in-game resources. So to start creating our HUD, we can go to our game folder, create a new script and call this hud.py. Like always, we're going to import pygame as PG. We're going to create our class called HUD. Inside the init method, we're going to pass it the height and the width of the screen, because a lot of the panels and elements will basically be proportions of the screen size. So we can save them inside the class. I'm going to set a general Hud Color, which is going to be used by all of the panels. I just chose a kind of browny beige color earlier, and so these are the RGB values, and also I'm going to introduce a little bit of transparency. So this is the alpha value, and if it's less than 255, then it creates a bit of transparency. I'm going to start creating the placeholder panels. So which panels do we want? We want a resources HUD, which is going to be like a kind of wide panel at the very top of the screen, just showing kind of which resources we currently have. So I'm going to say self.resources surface is pygame surface, and the dimensions of this, we want it to fit across the entire width of the screen, but we don't want it to be very kind of tall. I'm going to have a pretty short one because we're only going to display sort of numbers in a horizontal way, so we don't need much height here. So I'm going to put height, 2% of the height of the screen, and because we're introducing some transparency, I'm going to create the surface with so that it can create the alpha. Then I'm going to fill the screen with the HUD color that we've created. So that will ensure that the panel will be of this color. The next panel we're going to make is the panel for selecting which object we want to build. So I'm going to call this the building HUD, and so self.build surface, similar thing. So creating another pygame surface. We're going to have this in the kind of bottom right hand corner of the screen. So I'm going to give this a width of 0.15, and I'm going to give it a little bit more height, so 0.25, and again going to introduce this circ alpha kind of flag. Similar to the resources surface, we're going to fill this with the HUD color again. And the next placeholder we're going to make is a placeholder I'm going to call the select HUD. The point of this HUD is that if we built something in our game and we want to kind of examine what that object is, we want to have the functionality to click on that object, and then in a certain panel it's going to at least describe what this object is, and maybe it would have further actions that can be done. So that's the point of this HUD. So I'm going to call this select surface. I'm just going to copy this rather than type it out again. And going to have this in the center of the screen, also width-wise, and then towards the bottom of the screen. So there we go. And copying this one out again, so that we have a common color for all of our HUD elements. Next we can define the the draw method of this class. So to start drawing these placeholders, so define draw self, and we're going to pass it the screen eventually. So it doesn't really matter what order these placeholders are drawn to the screen, because they're all kind of in distinct parts of the screen. But I'm just going to go ahead and follow the same order as I define them. So for the resource HUD, I'm going to say screen.blit self.resources surface. Resources surface is going to, as I said before, be the width of the screen, so I'm going to start it in the top left corner. For the build HUD, I want this in the bottom right of the screen. So screen.blit self.build surface, and I'm going to take the self.width that we saved when we initialized the class. I'm going to multiply this by 0.84 because we define this to have a length of 0.15 of the width. I'm just giving like a 1% kind of difference, so it's slight. It's just not touching the end of the screen. Then for the height, I'm going to do a similar thing. So because this is 0.25, I could make this 0.75, but I'm going to leave, again, a little bit of room from the edge of the screen. Then finally we have our select HUD. So oops, there we go. And where do I want this? I want this in the middle of the screen, width-wise, and I've made this 30% of the width. So 1 minus 0.4 is 0.7, so I can make this 0.35, because then it will be centered. And for the height, I'm going to make it so it's at the bottom of the screen, but not quite touching the bottom. So instead of 0.8, I'm going to put 0.79. Okay, I think now is a good time for us to implement it into the game class and at least look at these placeholders to see if they look okay. So going to the game script and saying from .hud import HUD. Then I'm going to create it here. So self.hud equals HUD, self.width, self.height. We don't have any update method yet for the HUD, so we're just going to go directly to the draw method, and our HUD wants to be drawn after everything else because it needs to be on the kind of like the top layer. But I am going to put it before the FPS. So here I'm going to put self.hud draw, and I'm going to feed it self.screen. Now running the game, we can have a look at the HUD that we've just created. I have to scroll a bit to find the world, but we can see the HUD elements that we've created. So this is going to be our panel for selecting objects to build. This is going to be our panel for looking at what resources we have, and this is going to be our panel for selecting objects that exist in the world. Okay. The next task for us is to populate the building panel with some objects that we may want to place inside the world. Going back to the HUD script, before we start populating this building surface, I'm going to define a couple of utility functions that will help us. The first one is a function for scaling images. So we're going to use the tree and the rock that we've seen before. I've also added a couple of other objects, so two buildings, and we're going to use these images inside of the panel, but right now they're actually too big to fit into the panel, so we need a way of scaling them down. Pygame does come with a scaling function, but which we're going to use inside this function, but what we're going to do is we're going to scale it just by the width, but we want to keep the height in proportion. So this is the point of this function. So we're going to feed it an image. We're going to feed it the new width and the new height. We say if the width is none and the height is none, we don't want to apply any scaling, so we're just going to pass. Else if height is none, so we've given it we've specified a width, but we haven't specified a height. We're going to calculate the ratio of the desired width and the width of the image, and then using that we can calculate the proportional height. So the new height equals scale, which we've just calculated, multiplied by the height of the image. Then we can create this new image, and we're going to use from pygame.transform.scale image, so the image that we've passed through to the function, and forcing these to be integers, this new width and new height. I'm going to do a very similar thing for the width. So I'm just going to basically replace a lot of these values. So this is going to be get height instead. This is going to be the width. This will take this, and that's fine. Otherwise, if we specify both the width and the height, then we can just go straight to the scaling function, and that's going to be int w int height. And then finally, we're going to return the image. Next, we're going to write our method for loading the images. So define load images self. Going to just copy and paste because we've seen this code before, so it's not particularly interesting. I hope this is clear. We're just taking all of the different assets that we have in our graphics folder and returning them in a dictionary. So going back to the init method, we can start incorporating some of this. So I'm going to say self.images equals self.loadImages. Now we're going to start writing a method for populating this build surface. So I'm going to say define create build HUD. And in here, we're going to start adding all of the images that we've just loaded into this surface. So the first thing I need to calculate is where do I want to start rendering these images. So I'm going to calculate render pos equals, and it's going to be a 2-element list. I'm going to say self.width multiplied by 0.84 plus 10. So this is because we are drawing this build surface at this X position. So I want to start rendering our images at this position, but plus 10 pixels, so there's a little bit of room. I'm going to do exactly the same, but with the height. So it's going to be multiplied by 0.74. That's 74 plus 10 pixels. Then I'm going to calculate the width, or I'm going to calculate the width of this build surface and like divide it into parts. So I'm going to just call this object width. So that's the width of all of the objects we're going to put in the panel. And I'm going to say self.build.surface get the width and do an integer division by 5 to divide this into 5 equal parts. I'm going to create this empty list called tiles, which will contain all of the information of the different objects that we're going to stick inside this panel. Then I'm going to start iterating through the images that we've saved in our class. So that's that. So self.images.items. I'm going to create a copy of the render position. I'm going to create a copy of the image. I'm going to scale this image so that we can fit it within the panel. So I'm going to use the scale image function that we created. I'm going to use this temp image, and I'm going to enforce the width to be the object width. And finally, I'm also going to give each of these objects a rectangle so that we can easily interact with it later. So we can do this by extracting it from the image scale. So image scale.get rect, and we're going to position this at pos. Finally, I'm going to add all of this information into our tiles list. So I always like to keep things in dictionaries, so we're going to have the name of the image. We're going to have the icon, so that's the scaled version of the image. We're going to have the image itself, and we can extract that from our images dictionary using the image name key. And finally, the rectangle. Okay. Because we're iterating through, we will need to update the render position. Otherwise, they're all just going to be rendered on top of each other. So we're going to start off by laying them out horizontally, which means we need to update the x-axis. So updating the x position of render pos, and we're going to update it by the width of the scaled image, and again +10 so that there's no overlap. Finally, we're going to return this tiles list, then adding this into the init method. So self.tiles equals self.create build HUD. Now that we have all of the elements of this building panel, we can go to the draw method and start adding them in. So I'm going to say for tile in self.tiles, because it's a list, screen.blit, and we're going to extract the icon, which is the scaled version of the image, and we're going to render it in the position of the rectangle, because that's in the correct position. So extracting the top left of the rectangle should be that's meant to be tile. Going to run the game to test this. Yep, and now in our building panel we can see these four kind of miniature objects that we can eventually use to select and start placing in the world. To finish off the building panel, we're going to make sure that the tiles, the objects that we placed within the panel are interactable, and that we can select them and in the future start using them. So this is what we'll work on now. I'm going to begin by creating a new variable in the class called selected tile. So self.selected tile, going to initialize it as none. Then we're going to create a new method, and this is going to be our update method. Inside the update method, we want to be able to interact with these objects using the mouse. So first I'll need to extract the mouse's position. So we've seen that before. So pg.mouse.getPos. And then also we want to kind of click on these objects to interact with them. So I'm going to say mouse action is pg.mouse.getPressed. Then I'm going to iterate through all of the tiles within this panel, and we call these things self.tiles, or they're stored in the class as self.tiles. And because we gave each object a rectangle, we can use some collision logic in pygame, and we can say if the rectangle collides with the point, and we want to say the mouse position. So if the mouse is on top of the rectangle, and then inside this, we can say if we left click, so that's the 0 index position of mouse action, we can say self.selected tile equals the tile. And I'm also going to put in a little bit of logic to drop the selected tile. So I'm going to say if mouse action is the right click, then self.selected tile is going to revert back to none. Now that we have a logic for selecting the tiles, we want to draw this onto the screen to make sure it works. So before we draw any of the HUD panels, I'm going to say if self.selected tile is not none, so that means we've selected something. I'm going to take a copy of the image. Because selected tile was one of the elements of our tiles list, we know that it has an image included. I'm going to copy this to kind of let the player know that this is kind of just like a temporary placement rather than permanent. We're going to set an alpha value for this image, so increase the transparency. So I'm going to set the alpha to 100. And then we can blitz this image, draw this image to the screen in the position of the mouse. So including all of this into our game class, we need to include the HUD. We need to make sure that the HUD updates. So we're going to write that here. And I think that's all we need. So running the game again. And finding our world. And I'm going to select one of our objects. And here we can see that we've selected a building to place. You can right click to remove that. And same thing for the other objects. And so this will be useful functionality for the next part where we come to actually placing these tiles. So also with the rocks. Okay. The very final thing we're going to do in this part is to kind of finish off the resources panel, just to draw a few placeholders to give an idea of what it's going to look like. So this is for the resources section, and first I'm going to define the position of the first element. So I'm going to make this self.width minus 400, so that's 400 pixels away from the right hand side. Then I'm going to say for resource, I'm just going to come up a list of 3 typical resources. So I'm going to say wood, stone, and gold, let's say. That colon is meant to be inside. We're going to use the draw text function that we wrote in a previous part. So from.utils imports draw text. Right, going back down here. Yeah, we're going to use draw text, drawing to the screen. The text is going to be the resource. I'm going to make the size 30. I'm just going to make this white. And we're going to put it at 0 in the Y, so right at the top of the screen and in position of pos. And then I'm just going to update the pos by 100 pixels. So running the game again. There we have our kind of placeholders for the different resources that we might want to include on our game. Okay.